In our last segment, we saw how the right and the left have unknowingly teamed up to try and change the history of the Holocaust and Jewish history in general. We saw how the world's empathy towards the Jews and anti-Semitism has slowly disappeared and left the popular consciousness. So it is not a surprise now when we see that the belief extends to important figures of the Holocaust. How did a young Jewish girl from the Netherlands get wrapped up in this debate? Following the Holocaust, Anne's father Otto Frank returned to their home after being liberated from the Auschwitz death camp. He finds a notebook of his now deceased daughter that she had written while hiding from the Nazis. He eventually edited her diary and released it for publication. Anne's diary is a book that's been read by millions of young people across the globe. Anne Frank was technically European and therefore had a white appearance. What would be evident to anyone who simply knows her story is that she clearly wasn't white, or as the Germans in 1930s would have called it, Aryan, under the Nazi Nuremberg laws, the laws that stripped her and her family of all their rights and eventually their lives. Part of these laws and restrictions implemented first by the Nazis was to ensure that even and especially those Jews who looked white would be easily identifiable with markings on their clothing to show everyone that they were Jewish, and therefore less than. This clearly shows that not only was she not white, according to the Germans, but she had no privilege in their society. These laws stripped her of all basic rights, let alone any kind of privilege. Records were sought to ensure that every Jewish person was registered and forced to wear the Jewish symbol. So there really was no ability to hide as a white-facing Jew, contrary to what the left is suggesting. Many Jews were killed on the spot for being caught without wearing their Jewish markings in public. If their appearance did not give them away, their papers clearly marked with a J for Juden, wood. I wonder how the debate takes into account how many Jews were killed in this exact way, if they could simply walk the streets as a white person and not be noticed. Anne was someone who was identified, labeled, imprisoned, and eventually died because she was Jewish, and therefore not white enough. So how is she now seen to have white privilege? There is one place that Anne Frank's whiteness was important, and that was in the publication of her book itself. There's little doubt that Otto Frank had the ability and responsibility of editing Anne's diary in order to remove anything that was seen as damaging to himself, his family, or his daughter. It is this sanitization that is making the story more understandable to non-Jewish audiences and made the book a little more impactful to those around the world. It was exactly her perceived whiteness that made non-Jews and Western audience able to empathize with her story. They can see themselves, their sisters, their niece, or their children in Anne. It was this sanitization that opens up the ability for the left to claim that she was just a regular person with her white privilege. Once we remove Anne's status as a persecuted minority and her experience during the Holocaust, she's simply a young European white girl. And by extension, therefore using today's standard, she would have white privilege. What we can see here is the retroactive stripping of a Holocaust victim of her status as a persecuted minority. The left cannot seem to mourn the death of a young innocent girl who had done nothing to deserve it, as long as she's perceived as having some sort of privilege or power. This type of idea further gives the left the ability to not care about the deaths of Jews all over the world. Jews murdered in American synagogues are barely discussed and often used as symbolic martyrs in the left's attack against the Second Amendment-loving right. Jewish children in Israel hiding in bunkers for safety, like Anne Frank, are rarely, if ever, discussed in left-wing media, like the approximately 4,500 deadly, unguided rockets that were fired into Israeli civilian territory in 2021. But not only does this not get news coverage, it doesn't even get any sympathy from the people around the world. The right could care less about Jewish civilian casualties, and the left justifies their death and trauma by classifying them as white oppressive colonizers. Therefore, they deserve it. We can see how far the pendulum has swung in public opinion on the attacks against Jews from the post-World War II era until now. In my previous podcast, Globalizing Antisemitism, we looked into the very recent and open calls for a global intifada, or violent attacks against Jews in America and around the world. If you haven't heard about this, now you can see why. The Jews have lost their status as a people who have been persecuted, and most disturbingly, they've been labeled as oppressors themselves. The Jews are seen by the right as protocols of Zion cabals with aims of harming white people, and on the left as white people who have no right to claim to be a persecuted minority. And in order to satisfy their current views and justify their beliefs, both the left and the right have to rewrite the past, remove the anti-Semitism from the past during the Holocaust, and co-opt Anne Frank to make her white and privileged. In the end, we can see why the debate about Anne Frank is happening. It's a natural progression of what we've seen over and over again. Not only are we seeing in the modern time the slow deterioration of the recognition and empathy towards the Jewish experience when it comes to anti-Semitism, but we see that the fact that the Jews as a persecuted minority is also disappearing. As Barry Weiss puts it in her book, there is a hierarchy system being created within progressive movements. It is a race to the top for those who have the loudest and most recognized voices about oppression and hate based on a person's race, religion, background, or sexual orientation. Those who appear to be the most oppressed in society get the loudest voices. Whereas Jews used to be on the top of this list, as a group who have experienced a great deal of hate and oppression, they have not only dropped lower on the list of people who face discrimination, but they've been removed from the list completely, despite repeatedly being the number one targeted group across the globe, year after year. Long gone are the days where we'd see rabbis walking arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr. across the bridge at Selma, holding the Torah, clearly showing the understanding and connection between two minority groups who both were victims of hate and persecution. Today we see Jewish women are being banned from their participation in the Women's March in 2017. Leaders of the march are quoted as saying Jews need to confront their own role in racism. We have seen the absolute annihilation of the Jewish rights as a minority and persecuted group from the 1930s to the present day. The media and all political parties gloss over and hide the reality of anti-Semitism that exists with their moral gymnastics. This moral gymnastics includes the rewriting of history to allow people of today to forget and ignore the realities of what anti-Semitism in society looks like and what it may bring. We cannot let people rewrite the history of the past so we can see it happen again. The rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and discrimination is a warning from the past, as long as we don't pretend that the past never happened. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.